Imagine walking through a moonless night on the island of Crete. The stone beneath your feet vibrates with a low, rhythmic pulse, not the trembling of an earthquake, not the roar of the sea. Something else. Something breathing. You stop. The air is thick, warm, pressed against your skin like a hand that refuses to let go. There are no animals calling in the dark. No wind moving through the olive trees. Just that sound, deep, cavernous, rising from somewhere beneath the earth, the slow, enormous breath of something that should not exist. You look down. The stones around your feet are cracked. Not by centuries of weather. Not by the roots of ancient trees. By weight. By footsteps. By the passage of something so massive it left its mark in solid rock as if it were wet clay. You raise your eyes toward the center of the valley. And there, outlined against a blood-red moon, you see it. Two enormous horns splitting the sky. A silhouette of impossible proportions, half the shape of a man, half the shape of something older, something wilder, something that does not belong to the natural world. And in that moment, standing in the dark on an ancient island surrounded by the silence of a civilization long dead, you understand something that thousands of years of mythology have tried to bury. What the Greeks called a monster, what poets dressed in the language of divine punishment and royal shame, was never a metaphor. It was a memory. And the Book of Enoch may hold the key to understanding exactly what that memory was. The ancient world was not the world we imagine when we close our eyes and think of the past. It was not a simple place of primitive men and rudimentary tools. The ancient world, according to traditions preserved across dozens of cultures and thousands of miles of separation, was a world populated by beings of terrifying power, giants, hybrids, creatures born from the collision of the divine and the earthly. And among all the ancient texts that speak of this vanished world, one stands apart. One document, suppressed for centuries, excluded from the canonical Bible, buried in the libraries of Ethiopia and the caves of the Dead Sea, the Book of Enoch. The Book of Enoch does not speak in metaphors. It does not describe its events in the vague language of allegory. It describes, in precise and horrifying detail, what happened in the age before the Great Flood. It describes the descent of the Watchers. The Watchers, known in Hebrew as the Iron, were a group of celestial beings, sons of heaven, who looked down upon the daughters of men and were consumed by desire. According to the Book of Enoch, 200 of these beings descended to the summit of Mount Hermon and made a pact, a covenant of transgression, swearing to carry out their forbidden plan together. They descended. They took wives from among the daughters of men. And they produced offspring. The Book of Enoch describes these offspring in language that stops the breath of anyone who reads it carefully. The Nephilim. Giant hybrid beings whose height reached toward the sky, whose appetites could not be satisfied by any harvest the earth could produce, whose very existence represented a corruption of the order of creation so profound that it would eventually demand the total annihilation of the antediluvian world. But the Watchers did not stop with human women. This is where the hidden truth begins to surface. This is where the connection between the Book of Enoch and the ancient myths of Greece and the Mediterranean world begins to reveal itself. Chapter 7 of the Book of Enoch contains a detail that most readers pass over without fully absorbing its implications. The text states that the Watchers and their Nephilim offspring began to sin against birds, wild beasts, reptiles, and fish, consuming their flesh and drinking their blood. But certain ancient interpreters of this passage, working from Aramaic and Hebrew manuscripts older than any version we have today, understood this verse to describe something far more disturbing than simple dietary corruption. They understood it as a description of genetic corruption. Of unions between the fallen celestial beings and creatures that were not human. Of hybrid Nephilim born not only from the union of angels and women, but from the union of supernatural beings and animals. Hybrid abominations. Creatures that were neither fully beast nor fully man. Creatures that carried within their enormous bodies the same corrupted divine fire that animated all the Nephilim, but expressed in forms that the natural world had never seen before and would never see again after the waters of the flood reclaimed the earth. Now hold that thought. Hold it carefully. And turn your eyes toward the island of Crete. Toward the civilization that archaeologists call Minoan, one of the oldest and most sophisticated cultures of the ancient Mediterranean world. A civilization that predates classical Greece by more than 1,000 years. A civilization whose religious art is dominated, obsessed, saturated with a single image, the sacred bull. The Minoans worshipped the bull with an intensity that went far beyond simple animal veneration. The bull was not merely a powerful animal to the Minoan mind. The bull was divine. The bull was the axis around which the sacred world turned. Their palaces were decorated with enormous frescoes of bulls. Their religious ceremonies centered on the bull. Their most important ritual, the bull-leaping ceremony depicted in some of the most famous art of the ancient world, placed young men and women in direct physical contact with the sacred animal, vaulting over its horns in an act of terrifying intimacy between the human and divine. Why? Why would an entire civilization, sophisticated enough to build multi-story palaces with running water and drainage systems, organize its entire spiritual world around the image of a bull? The ancient Greeks who came after the Minoans had an answer. And that answer was the Minotaur. The myth of the Minotaur is one of the most famous stories in all of Greek mythology. The version that has survived to the modern world tells it like this: King Minos of Crete prayed to Poseidon for a sign of divine favor. Poseidon sent a magnificent white bull from the sea, intending for Minos to sacrifice it. Minos kept the bull instead. As punishment, Poseidon caused Minos's wife, Pasiphae, to fall into an unnatural obsession with the bull. The union between Pasiphae and the sacred bull produced a child, a creature with the body of a man and the head of a bull. The Minotaur. Minos, horrified, commissioned the architect Daedalus to construct a vast labyrinth beneath his palace, a prison complex of such complexity that the creature could never escape. There the Minotaur lived, fed on tribute from Athens, young men and women sent every 7 years to satisfy its hunger, until the hero Theseus descended into the labyrinth and killed the hybrid giant. This is the myth. This is the version that classical Greece preserved. But myths do not emerge from nothing. Every myth is a translation. Every myth is a memory that has passed through so many human minds and so many centuries that its original form has been compressed, distorted, allegorized beyond easy recognition. The question is not whether the Minotaur existed. The question is, what was the original memory that the myth of the Minotaur was translating? Consider the evidence carefully. The Minoans preceded the Greeks. The Minoan civilization was already ancient when the Greeks were still in their earliest stages of cultural formation. When Greek culture absorbed Minoan traditions, it processed them through its own mythological framework, turning what may have been genuine ancient memories into stories of gods, curses, and heroes. But what if the original Minoan tradition was not a myth at all? What if the Minoan tradition was a historical memory, distorted by time, yes, but grounded in something real that had occurred in the antediluvian world? The Book of Enoch describes the Nephilim as hybrid giants born from forbidden unions. It describes the corruption of creation as extending beyond the human bloodline. Ancient interpreters identified this corruption as the source of the hybrid creatures that appear in the mythologies of every ancient culture: the centaurs, the minotaurs, the sphinxes, the creatures with human intelligence and animal bodies that populate the sacred art and sacred stories of the entire ancient Mediterranean world. The Nephilim hybrid theory does not ask us to take mythology literally. It asks us to consider that mythology may be the only vehicle through which a pre-literate world could preserve the memory of events so catastrophic, so far outside the normal range of human experience, that they could only be processed through the language of sacred story. The ancient Mesopotamian texts offer another angle of entry into this mystery. The Sumerian king list, one of the oldest historical documents ever discovered, describes a period before the Great Flood when kings ruled for impossibly long periods of time. Thousands of years. Tens of thousands of years. Modern scholars dismiss these figures as mythological exaggeration. But the Book of Enoch and the traditions it preserves suggest a different interpretation. In the antediluvian world, time itself may have operated differently. The Nephilim, carrying within them the biology of fallen celestial beings, may have been subject to a different relationship with time, with aging, with the physical limits that govern purely human existence. The Sumerian texts also describe hybrid creatures, the Apkallu, the 7 sages who brought civilization to humanity before the flood. These sages are depicted in ancient Mesopotamian art as beings with the bodies of men and the heads or features of animals, fish, birds, hybrid forms that echo with uncomfortable precision the descriptions of Nephilim corruption in the Book of Enoch. The ancient world was saturated with the memory of hybrid beings. Across Mesopotamia and Egypt and Greece and Crete, the same fundamental image appears again and again, a being of enormous power, carrying both the human and the animal, existing at the boundary between the divine and the natural. A Nephilim hybrid. A creature born from the transgression of the Watchers against the order of creation. The labyrinth itself deserves careful attention. In the myth of the Minotaur, the labyrinth is not simply a prison. It is a cosmological structure, a sacred geography designed to contain something so dangerous, so incompatible with the ordinary world, that it had to be separated from normal existence by an architecture of absolute complexity. The real palace of Knossos, the great Minoan palace excavated by Arthur Evans at the beginning of the 20th century, is itself a structure of labyrinthine complexity. Hundreds of rooms, corridors that turn back on themselves, storage chambers and sacred spaces and administrative halls interconnected in a pattern that modern archaeologists describe as disorienting even to map. Was the palace of Knossos itself the labyrinth? Was it built not as a royal residence in the ordinary sense, but as a sacred containment structure, a vast architectural system designed to house and control something that the Minoan civilization both worshipped and feared? If the Minotaur was a Nephilim hybrid, a creature of enormous physical size carrying the corrupted divine biology of the Watchers, then the labyrinth makes perfect sense not as mythological metaphor but as practical necessity. You do not build a labyrinth to impress visitors. You build a labyrinth to contain something that must never be allowed to leave. The question of size is important here. The Book of Enoch describes the Nephilim in terms of height that strain the modern imagination. Ancient manuscripts preserve figures that suggest these beings were not simply tall men but creatures of genuinely colossal proportions. A Nephilim hybrid carrying the genetics of a fallen celestial being and the physical structure of a bull, one of the most powerfully built animals in the natural world, would have been a creature of terrifying size and strength. Not the relatively modest hybrid depicted in classical Greek vase paintings. Something vast. Something that would have required an enormous architectural structure to contain. Something whose existence would have been so traumatic to the human communities that encountered it that the memory of that encounter would have been preserved across thousands of years and hundreds of miles of cultural transmission. This is not mythology. This is the logic of historical memory operating through the only vehicle available to pre-literate cultures: sacred story, ritual practice, and architectural monument. The Book of Enoch tells us why the Nephilim and their hybrid offspring ultimately disappeared from the earth. The Watchers were judged. The transgression they had committed, the corruption of creation, the production of hybrid abominations, the filling of the earth with violence and contamination, was so severe that the divine council decreed total annihilation. The Great Flood was not simply a natural disaster. According to the tradition preserved in Enoch, it was a targeted act of cosmic cleansing, the erasure of a corrupted world so that creation could begin again from a preserved remnant of uncorrupted human bloodline. Noah and his family were chosen not merely because of their righteousness in a moral sense, but because, and this detail is crucial, their bloodlines had not been corrupted by the Nephilim contamination. They were, in the language of the text, perfect in their generations. Genetically uncorrupted. The flood killed the Nephilim and their hybrid offspring. It killed the Minotaur, if such a creature existed. It killed every manifestation of the Watcher transgression that had been born into the antediluvian world. But it could not kill the memory. Memory is more resilient than flesh. Memory survived the flood and the stories that the survivors carried with them as they rebuilt civilization on the other side of the catastrophe. The Minoan civilization that archaeologists have uncovered on Crete is estimated to have reached its peak around 1700 BCE, but its roots extend much deeper, into a prehistory that connects it to the oldest strata of Mediterranean culture. The bull worship of the Minoans, the labyrinthine palace of Knossos, the myth of the Minotaur that the Greeks preserved from older Cretan tradition, these are not the inventions of a sophisticated Bronze Age culture looking for interesting religious imagery. They are the preserved residue of a much older memory. A memory of the antediluvian world. A memory of the Nephilim hybrids that walked the earth before the flood swept them away. A memory so powerful, so deeply embedded in the collective consciousness of the ancient Mediterranean world, that it survived the total destruction of the civilization that originally carried it. The Minotaur was not a metaphor. The Minotaur was a Nephilim hybrid. And the Book of Enoch, suppressed, excluded, buried for centuries by institutions that found its contents too dangerous, too destabilizing, too incompatible with the tidy mythological frameworks that organized religious power, is the document that preserves the hidden truth of what that creature actually was. The ancient world knew things that we have forgotten. Not because the knowledge was destroyed, but because it was hidden. Hidden in plain sight, inside the myths that every culture preserved. Inside the sacred stories that every ancient civilization told about the time before the flood, the time when the boundaries between heaven and earth were not fixed, the time when beings of divine origin walked among men and produced offspring that shook the foundations of the created order. The Minotaur stands at the center of one of those myths, monstrous, compelling, impossible to explain away as simple allegory. And the Book of Enoch, written by a man who walked with God and saw the secrets of heaven and earth, offers the explanation that the mythological tradition alone cannot provide. A Nephilim hybrid. Born from the transgression of a watcher. Contained in a labyrinth on an island in the ancient Mediterranean. Remembered in the sacred art and sacred stories of a civilization that worshipped the bull because the bull, in their oldest memory, was something divine. Something terrifying. Something that had once walked among them in flesh that should not have existed. The hidden truth was never truly hidden. It was waiting. In the Book of Enoch, in the ruins of Knossos, in the cracked stones of a valley on a moonless night on the island of Crete. Waiting for someone willing to ask the question that mythology alone cannot answer. What if the Minotaur was real? What if it was a Nephilim hybrid? And what other ancient memories are still waiting, buried in myths we have never read carefully enough, for the moment when someone finally asks the right question?